As a boy in 1964, when I left Ireland, it was the first film I ever saw. It was magic. It was Goldfinger. It was unbelievable. It was a naked lady covered in gold paint. It was just sheer magic. And the man, you know, odd job with the hat and everything like that. It was the sheer sophistication. You know, life changed for me.
Which one is your favourite James Bond movie and why? Goldfinger, I think, is my favourite James Bond movie. I love Dr. No, but it was sort of where Sean Connery became the James Bond that we know and love.
What is there to say about Goldfinger that hasn't already been said? It is, quite simply, the movie that made James Bond what it is today and redefined spy movies forever. I mean, this is the movie that gave us Desmond Llewellyn's Q and the Aston Martin DB5, complete with an array of iconic gadgets. It gave us the sensational title song by Shirley Bassey and the accompanying score by John Barry. It gave us the beautiful sequence of Bond and Tilly chasing Goldfinger through the Swiss Alps. It gave us Ken Adams' massively ambitious sets, one of which housed probably the best interrogation scene not just in Bond but in all of cinema. It also gave us one of the most interesting Bond girls of them all, along with the most famous henchman of the series, and of course one of the all-time great Bond villains.
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
It managed to be both a faithful adaptation of Ian Fleming's novel while also improving on that book's shortcomings. And of course, it's led by the one and only Sir Sean Connery at the absolute peak of his tenure as 007. Even though it is only the third film in the series, all of this and more is why Goldfinger is widely regarded as one of, if not the best of them all. Almost every scene has some sort of iconic moment, and it is undoubtedly the James Bond movie that had the biggest impact on cinema and popular culture. It redefined action movies, launched a wave of spy movies akin to the deluge of superhero movies we got in the 2000s, and went on to be parodied by everyone from The Simpsons to the Beatles.
That's as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
So much of what people think of when they think of James Bond comes back to this movie, and to this day it remains the standard against which all other Bond films are judged. But, and I know this will land me in some sort of Bond fan prison, but it is not perfect. In the same way Goldfinger represents the definitive example for all the good things about James Bond movies, so too does it represent some of the bad things about James Bond movies, mainly the fact that some aspects of them have not really aged very well and the way in which a lot of them start to come apart in the third act.
Sir, I'm aware of my shortcomings.
But despite its flaws, Goldfinger's legacy cannot be overstated. It is more than just a James Bond movie. It is the James Bond movie, and it stands alongside classics like Psycho and Star Wars as movies that revolutionized their genres and cinema as a whole. Even if you're not a James Bond fan, Goldfinger is still essential viewing if you want to understand the history of Western cinema. So in its 60th anniversary year, let's take a look at Goldfinger and explore how it took the James Bond series from being a popular British spy series into a global cinematic sensation the likes of which the world had never seen.
Anything else?
Well, I won't keep you for more than an hour or so if you give me your undivided attention.
Work on the Goldfinger movie had begun while From Russia with Love was still being made. Dr. No had been a smash hit, and Eon were confident that its follow-up would generate enough interest to warrant another sequel, and so they gave it a budget the size of the first two Bond movies combined, and once again hired screenwriter Richard Maybaum to adapt one of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. And the book he chose was, of course, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But producers 𝗬𝗄𝗆 and Harry Saltzman wanted the next Bond movie to be released in 1964, only a year or so after From Russia with Love. And since a large chunk of 𝗬𝗄𝗆 would have required filming in Switzerland during the winter, the filmmakers realized that they wouldn't be able to make the production arrangements work in time to film it there and still meet their target release date, and so Goldfinger was chosen instead to become Bond movie number 3. Like From Russia with Love before it, Goldfinger is a relatively faithful adaptation of Fleming's novel of the same name, which was first published in 1959. The broad flow of the story is the same in both versions. Bond foils Goldfinger in Miami before getting briefed by M and the Bank of England about his gold smuggling operations. He plays the villain in golf, follows him to Switzerland where he is apprehended, taken to Kentucky, and finally stops the Fort Knox plot. But unlike From Russia with Love, the Goldfinger movie also makes a number of creative departures from its source material, almost all of which I consider to be improvements. We'll come back to those, but by way of example, most of the second half of the book involves Bond performing mundane secretarial tasks for Goldfinger. People who insist on going back to ultra-faithful adaptations of Fleming never quite appreciate how much those books involve Bond sitting behind a desk somewhere moaning about paperwork. But anyway, Goldfinger does represent the starting point of the Bond films decoupling themselves from being just direct Fleming adaptations and turning into something with their own identity. Give or take a giant squid, Dr. No is a pretty direct adaptation of the book, while From Russia with Love changed that book's structure, but otherwise it stands alongside 𝗬𝗵𝗫𝗃 and Thunderball as the most literal Fleming to film adaptation. Goldfinger showed an increasing level of confidence by Eon Productions to take what worked from the Fleming books and add their own spin on it. They didn't want Bond to be just classic espionage movies. They wanted them to be bigger, more fantastical action adventures that could appeal to children and adults alike. And they weren't alone in this. Sean Connery himself admitted in various interviews at the time that while he respected the author, he wasn't particularly worried about being faithful to Fleming.
I've only read 2 of the books, 1.5 of the books. I've read 2 of the books.
Is it a very faithful script to Fleming's original novel?
I have never read the novel. I only read about 3 of them. I read Thunderball, because that was the first one we were supposed to do, Live and Let Die, and From Russia with Love.
Why have you not read the rest?
I don't really know.
Can you imagine a Bond actor saying this today? Hell, can you imagine any actor playing any literary role admitting that he had barely even read the books the character was based on? But for me, this just highlights the fact that so much of what we tend to associate with the character of Bond came from Connery, not Fleming. In the books, Bond tends to be fairly direct in his speech. His inner monologue is often grumpy, judgmental, and patronizing. He knows what he likes: food, gambling, cars, women, and to hell with anyone who thinks otherwise. Now, we do see a lot of that in the movies as well, of course, but in my eyes, the literary Bond lacks a lot of the wit, charm, and sense of humor that his cinematic counterpart has, and so he just comes across as, well, someone who probably wouldn't be very fun to be around. That's not the case with Connery's James Bond, and it never was. Like Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones or Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark, Connery and Bond were the perfect harmony of character and actor right from their first appearance. By the time Goldfinger came around, he was so firmly established in the role that it was impossible to imagine anyone else playing Bond. No wonder it took 2 attempts to replace him. The early Bond movies were successful because Sean Connery carried them, and a huge part of how he did that came down to the fact that he understood that these stories had an element of the absurd to them.
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming.
So he saw it as his job to bring the audience along with him, to encourage them to embrace that absurdity, suspend their disbelief for a moment, and above all, to have fun.
In the first instance, I felt that there was a lack of humor about them. And when I raised this point with Ian, he was quite surprised, because he felt he was quite humorous. He was, as a man, humorous, Ian himself. But in writing the character Bond, he wasn't. And that was one of the first things that one had to do, was to imbue a humorous aspect. Therefore, one would get a sort of upbeat ending to scenes and situations. Therefore, they could acknowledge and accept the violence if it had a humoresque quality.
I mean, Ian Fleming himself even once said that he thought the films had too much humour in them, to which Richard 𝗵𝗶𝗀 retorted that was in fact his intention. Now, before I get lasered in half by Fleming fans here, I do like most of his Bond books. I'm not criticising them, I'm just pointing out the ways in which Sean Connery and the wider creative team behind the movies took what Fleming had written and changed it to both work for the screen and to appeal to a wider audience. But 𝗵𝗶𝗀 did not adapt Fleming's novel alone. He worked on several drafts alongside another writer called Paul Den, who had been hired by Harry Saltzman after the producer rejected 𝗵𝗶𝗀's first draft. At first, the movie was written as a very direct adaptation of the novel, with only some small changes here and there. In a recent book, which he has made freely available, Bond geek 𝗬𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗃 meticulously archives the scripting process for every Bond film. For Goldfinger, 𝗬𝗵𝗃 details the way in which the drafts of the treatment and script slowly change details and scenes from the novel to the movie. We'll come to these changes as they're relevant, but the slowly evolving nature of how Goldfinger was adapted from the novel to the final movie shows us how in these early days of the series, there was still a sense of trying to find the right formula and tone for the cinematic Bond. Now on to the 3rd movie in their series, Eon were increasingly leaning into both the cinematic potential of Bond as well as Connery's portrayal of the character. But something else that marked the evolution of the Bond film series was the choice to bring on Guy Hamilton as the director. Terence Young had directed the first 2 Bond movies and is also largely credited with helping Connery to find the character. But with 2 successful Bonds behind him, he wanted to move on to other things, and so the producers brought in Hamilton. He shared many of Connery's views around what the tone and style of the film should be. And that attitude is on display right from the start of the movie.
If we could do the pre-credit sequence, which is a wonderful piece of nonsense. If that makes you laugh, let's all now, after the credit titles, go for a great big ride and have fun.
Consistent with the 2 films before it and the 17 that would follow up to Casino Royale, we open with the gun barrel, although like in the first 2 movies, stuntman Bob Simmons is in the crosshairs, not Connery himself. But we open on a sinister looking industrial plant of some sort, and then, out of the shadows...
A duck!
Yep, the definitive James Bond movie starts with Bond sneaking into a base with a snorkel disguised as a duck, and if that doesn't make you laugh, then I don't want to be your friend. But this scene was a very significant innovation for the series because it is the first true incarnation of the Bond pre-title sequence. From Russia with Love had experimented with this, but it didn't feature the real James Bond and was very much treated as a means to establish the villain. Here, both Guy Hamilton and the screenwriters wanted to jump right into the movie with a short adventure completely unrelated to the rest of the series. Now technically the adventure is adapted from Fleming, but only loosely. The novel opens with a broody Bond reflecting on a job in Mexico that had resulted in him having to kill someone. But the Bond in this chapter is in a dark mood, as he often is, pondering his culpability and guilt over killing someone in the line of duty. It actually has a lot more in common with the opening scene of Casino Royale.
Made you feel it, did he?
But to open the Goldfinger movie, Dan and Maibaum wanted a different tone from the novel, and so decided to show Bond on that mission. And unlike the book, they chose to show Connery's Bond as the unflappable, smooth operator that we know and love. Neither approach is wrong, but the divergence between the book and the movie is a clear example of how the filmmakers saw the character compared to Fleming. The decision to start the movie like this would firmly establish the pre-title sequence as a fundamental part of the Bond movie formula. From this moment onwards, they would go on to be among the most recognizable and beloved aspects in all of Bond, and have also been the single most consistent aspect of the series. It even survived the formula shake-up of the Daniel Craig films, unlike the gun barrel. And watching the Goldfinger scene, you can see why. He sneaks into the base, plants explosives and then escapes, and unzips his wetsuit to reveal a perfect tuxedo, into which he plants that oh so iconic carnation. Then he goes off to watch a dancer and calmly lights a cigarette to the exact moment of the explosion. The calm, almost bored walk he gives here while surrounded by the panic is just pure Connery, as is of course the fact that he's shacked up with the dancer. But of course there's a fight, and it's a surprisingly brutal one that ends with Bond electrocuting the man to death and leaving with the most classic of Bond quips.
Shocking. Positively shocking.
That line, the suit, the duck, the whole sequence is just a perfect representation of everything we love about the cinematic James Bond, and Goldfinger delivers us that in 5 minutes before bringing us into the Bond song to end all Bond songs.
Goldfinger!
In case you haven't already worked out, I'm going to be using words like iconic a lot in this video because, well, it's just true. In the same way Goldfinger set the standard against which all future Bond films are measured, so too did Shirley Bassey set the standard for what a Bond song should be.
I heard that dun 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 dun, and I just got goose pimples, you know.
Longtime Bond composer John Barry wrote the piece, complete with its anthem-like brass notes and the sleazy tones that are just such a perfect match for Goldfinger's personality. But it's the soaring voice of Shirley Bassey that gives it a life of its own.
The man with the Midas touch.
Like the pre-credits sequence, using the song over the opening titles is another Bond hallmark that can be traced back to this movie. Dr. No used the title sequence after the gun barrel set to the Bond score, while From Russia with Love used a melody of the title song, but not the full version. Goldfinger gave us the Bond song as we know it today, where for a few minutes, the singer becomes the star of the movie. And then, as pretty much every subsequent Bond composer would, John Barry wove the song into the score of the entire film, giving a consistent musical flavour to the story that can be traced back to those opening titles. Now, Goldfinger is hardly my favourite Bond song, but somehow it still manages to capture everything we love about the music of Bond, and every time you hear those opening notes, you can't help but be swept up in it. After the song, we find Bond in good hands in Miami, where he rendezvous with Felix Leiter, played in this movie not by Jack Lord from Dr. No, but by Cec Linder. And here we find another recurring feature of the Bond series, recasting Felix in pretty much every movie. Now, this pretty much always happened for behind-the-scenes reasons. In this case, Jack Lord wanted more money and co-billing with Connery, but it's always been a funny quirk of the Bond movies that pretty much everyone else remains consistent except for Felix. Anyway, Felix delivers Bond a message from M, instructing him to keep an eye on Goldfinger. We'll come back to Gert Frobe's portrayal of the villain soon, but this is another case of the movie improving on the novel. In the book, Bond is approached by an old acquaintance and asked to figure out how Goldfinger is cheating him, only for Bond to return to London and by complete coincidence be tasked to investigate him. It's much neater for the spooks to just be interested in Goldfinger from the start. Now, I'll say two things about this scene. The first is that Ian Fleming visited the set while this scene was being filmed. There are some great photos of him, Sean Connery and Shirley Eaton on the excellent Thunderballs Photo Archive website, which is where I sourced most of the still images in this video from. Because these scenes were pretty much all filmed on a set in Pinewood. They only shot a tiny handful of wide shots and this one on location in Miami. The rest is just an indoor set and some rear projection and you totally can't tell at all. But sadly, Ian Fleming never got to see the finished production. Just a few weeks after his visit to the set, he died on the 12th of August 1964 at the age of just 56. Fleming had enjoyed the early success of the first two Bond films, but would never witness the sheer Bond mania that swept the Western world after Goldfinger came out. The second thing I'll say about this scene is that Sean Connery must be the only man in history who can pull off a short one-piece romper made out of baby blue towel linen. Anyway, the Miami sequence is the perfect showcase of how Connery managed to subtly inject humour and charm into each scene. Like when he breaks into Goldfinger's room with nothing but a charismatic smile and ridiculous doses of confidence.
That's Mr. Goldfinger's suite.
Yes, I know.
There, he finds Jill Masterson helping Goldfinger win by spying on his opponent's cards. Besides inexplicably renaming her character from Master Tin to Master Sin, this is straight from the book, but of course the movie has this.
Who are you?
Bond. James Bond.
This has to be one of the best examples of the catchphrase in the entire series. I know that first one from Dr. No gets all the credit, but to me, this is Connery's finest version of the line. And he says it while wearing a short one-piece romper made out of towel linen. Amazing. Anyway, in classic Bond fashion, he foils the villain's scheme by brazenly revealing himself.
Now hear this, Goldfinger. Your luck has just changed.
And also in classic Bond fashion, he then seduces the girl.
I'm beginning to like you, Mr. Bond.
Oh, what on earth are we going to do about it?
But as he goes to retrieve another bottle of champagne, he's knocked out. Guy Hamilton wasn't afraid to show Bond getting hurt, beaten, and captured. He wasn't afraid to make our hero vulnerable, and out of all the Connery Bond movies, I think Goldfinger is the best example of the way in which he is constantly placed at a disadvantage. Every time Bond gets a win over Goldfinger, Goldfinger gets a win over Bond, because when he awakes, he goes into the next room and sees, of course, it is such a defining image of the series that even the Bond canon itself would go on to directly reference it. But as iconic as the Golden Girl is, Connery's face and silence conveys so much here, especially when we contrast that with the cheekiness and humour from his earlier scenes. Part of Connery's strength in the role was the way in which he could suddenly harden like this, pivoting instantly to show the darker side of the character when it was called for.
She's covered in paint. Gold paint.
Bond returns to London and is told to meet M later that day, after which we have the treat of seeing Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell on screen together.
You come around for dinner, and I'll cook you a beautiful angel cake.
Here, like in all of their movies, their flirting and chemistry is just electric, and I wish the scenes that they shared were longer.
Money Penny. Won't you ever believe me?
Moving on, and we get the obligatory exposition dump about Goldfinger and M instructing Bond to investigate how he's smuggling gold out of the UK. But first, he's told to report to Q Branch.
Morning, Q.
Morning, 007.
Desmond Llewellyn is an absolute staple of the series, who with just one exception appeared in every single Bond movie from 1963 to his death in 1999. More than any other actor, director, writer, hell, even producer, Desmond was the most constant and enduring presence of the entire series, and I think his portrayal of Q was in no small part of what made these films so successful. Even now, his final scene is one of the more emotional moments of the series.
Always have an escape plan.
Like so much of Bond, that all started here. He had appeared in From Russia with Love, of course, giving Bond his attaché case, but it's a fairly generic role. The character doesn't have anything to work with, he's just there to deliver some exposition. In Goldfinger, Guy Hamilton wanted to shake that up and actually give Q a personality and a dynamic with Bond similar to the rapport he had with the likes of M and Moneypenny. And this is where Hamilton made arguably his biggest contribution to the entire Bond series, because at first, Llewellyn planned to play Q as kind of being in awe of Bond, like the audience.
At the rehearsals, I was working at a desk and Bond comes in, and I got up to greet him, and I thought, well, but this is Bond, this is James Bond, and I'm just an ordinary civil servant. I must admire him like everybody else does.
But Hamilton refuted that completely.
And Guy said, no, you don't take any notice of this man, you don't like him. He doesn't treat your gadgets with any respect at all.
What a fantastic choice that was. It was a decision that would form the basis of the character for the next 6 decades of Bond films, and it's another example of Guy Hamilton understanding the need for Bond to get called out for his bullshit every so often. He swaggers around as king of the world, but when he's in Q's lab, Q wants nothing more than to get rid of him. Bond's relationship and dynamic with M, Moneypenny, and Felix would change and evolve depending on the actors and the story, but the exasperation and impatience Q has for Bond would never change, and I absolutely love it.
I never joke about my work, 007.
This scene set the template for all the other Q branch scenes, showing off some ludicrous background gadgets just for the sake of pure spectacle, and then having Q walk Bond through his various vehicles and gadgets. And of all the gadgets and all the cars and all of Bond, have we ever really topped this?
And engage and fire the passenger ejector seat. Whoosh.
The DB5 is introduced like a movie star in its own right, which to be fair, it is. The car was largely modified by special effects legend John Steers, the same John Steers who designed the lightsaber. Besides the ejector seat, all of the gadgets were built into the real car and function as they're shown in the movie. The decision to use the Aston was partly based on the fact that in the book, Bond swaps his Bentley for a DB Mark III, something acknowledged in the movie.
Where's my Bentley?
Oh, he's had its day, I'm afraid.
It sounds crazy now, but Aston Martin were reluctant to let the production use their car at all, not being convinced it would lead to an increase in sales. Of course, it went on to become one of the most successful examples of product placement in movie history. Anyway, Bond leaves Q Branch and arranges to bump into Goldfinger at the golf club. And it's in this scene that we get our first real sense of one of the most enduring and formidable villains Bond has ever faced.
Goldfinger!
Gert Frobe was a German actor who was more or less unknown to English-speaking audiences until this movie came out. At first, 𝗬𝗫𝗀𝗀 wanted a more famous actor like Orson Welles to play the villain, but he was too expensive, and so they screen-tested cheaper faces like 𝗵𝗺𝗶𝗀𝗀 and Tito Vandis, among others. But it was after the producers saw Frobe's performance in a German movie that he was invited to play the part. But there was a problem when he arrived on set.
Yes, he's the perfect Goldfinger. Does he speak English? Yeah, I've spoken to his agent, he speaks English. Gert Frobe arrived day one on the set. How do you do? I'm very happy to meet you. That was all right. Then I talked to him and I realized he didn't speak a word of English.
So Frobe's entire performance as Goldfinger is dubbed by the English actor Michael Collins.
Oh no, let's be quite true, it wasn't my performance, it was Gert Frobe's performance. Let's say it's like a crossword puzzle. Mr. Frobe had all the answers, he knew all the answers, produced them pretty well, but his vocal pencil was blunt and I just went in and outlined what he'd said.
Now, after the movie came out, Collins was recognised to some extent for his role in making Goldfinger such an iconic villain, but it's a nuance that I think has been lost over time, partly because he is never even credited in the movie itself. Now, you might think it sounds a bit strange that such a major role could be done in this way with the dubbed actor not getting any credit. I mean, both David Prowse and James Earl Jones were credited for portraying and voicing Darth Vader, respectively, but a decade and a half earlier when Goldfinger was being made, it was much more common even for leading roles to have separate voice and physical actors. In the early Bond films, almost all of the Bond girls' voices are dubbed, and usually by actress Nikki van der Zyl, who, like Collins, also went uncredited for her work voicing iconic roles like Honey Rider, Domino, and Solitaire. She even did the voice for Shirley Eaton's character in Goldfinger. With some notable exceptions like Lois Maxwell, Honor Blackman, and Diana Rigg, it was very common at the time for Bond's leading ladies to be cast primarily based on their looks, rather than their overall acting ability. But it was more uncommon for male male actors to get the same treatment, but in Goldfinger's case, it really worked. What makes Goldfinger so memorable is the way in which the physical performance by Frobe and the dub from Collins match up so perfectly. Frobe is a formidable physical presence who flips between Goldfinger's amiable public face and his sinister, darker, angry side with complete ease. Collins, meanwhile, absolutely nails the accent and the timing, as well as capturing the inherent air of superiority that Goldfinger brings to every situation.
Choose your next witticism carefully, Mr. Bond. It may be your last.
We'll come back to the laser scene, of course, but we see a lot of this during the game of golf. Now, golf is hardly a cinematic or exciting sport, and yet this scene is just so intriguing because of the stakes involved. This is something that's lost on you when you read the book. The golf scene in the book goes on for such a long time, with Fleming describing in detail every single stroke and shot over the course of about 3 chapters. The filmmakers knew this scene wasn't about the game itself, but about Bond confronting Goldfinger, and I just love it whenever Bond teases the villain and makes it obvious how much he's enjoying himself doing so.
Oh, bad luck, you're in the rough.
But when the game is over, we get one of the all-time great Bond villain lines.
Many people have tried to involve themselves in my affairs, unsuccessfully.
The threat is backed up by Oddjob's head-slicing hat, a feature of the Bond series just as famous as any of the gadgets Bond himself used, and one that gets parodied just as much.
Who throws a shoe? Honestly.
Now, the character of Oddjob is a mute Korean, but he was played by Japanese-American actor Harold Sakata. He was an Olympic weightlifter who won a silver medal for the USA in 1948 before taking up wrestling. Goldfinger was his first acting job, and it's a testament to his physicality that his silent character with only a few minutes of screen time would leave such a lasting legacy on the Bond series. Every subsequent tough guy Bond henchman would try to live up to Oddjob, but besides perhaps Jaws, none of them are as memorable as Sakata. Crushing the golf ball like that was another absurd flourish by director Guy Hamilton that shows how his approach to Bond helps define the tone of the series.
Sean hated this because he thought Oddjob squashing a golf ball was ridiculous, because nobody can squash a golf ball. And I'm trying to say, but that's the whole point.
Case in point, it is yet another thing Goldfinger did that went on to be directly referenced by a future Bond movie. Anyway, Bond places the tracker on Goldfinger's Rolls Royce and follows him to Switzerland, and is this sequence the single best non-action scene in all of Bond? I think so. It's absolutely beautiful watching the Aston and the Rolls cruise through the 𝗃𝗀𝗃 Pass. Connery shows us the boredom he is feeling at the tedious nature of the journey when suddenly... I love Connery's reaction here. We know with just a look at his face that he'd love nothing more than to race after the pretty girl in the Ford, but he thinks twice.
Discipline 007.
It's such a great little moment showing us Bond's character, his boyish enthusiasm, but also his professionalism and commitment to the mission. Not to worry though, in GoldenEye he'd finally get to have his race against the next girl.
Who's that?
The next girl.
After being shot at, Bond chases the girl in the Ford, who we later learn is Tilly Masterson, played by English actress Tanya Mallet, who, fun fact, was considered for the role of Tatiana in From Russia with Love. Tilly is the sister of Jill and is hunting Goldfinger in order to get revenge for her sister's death. Tilly is another small but memorable role in Goldfinger. In the book, she's a major character who accompanies Bond for much of the adventure, but the character only appears in 2 scenes of the movie. But nonetheless, she makes an impression. She is focused, independent, and determined, and also refreshingly uninterested in Bond. In the novel, she is written as a queer character who falls in love with Pussy Galore. Now, whether or not she is coded as queer in the film is open to interpretation, but the fact is, she is one of the very few Bond girls to appear alongside Sean Connery and not shack up with him. So after dropping her at a garage, the two are shortly reunited in the woods near Goldfinger's factory. Bond does some classic spy work and sees the rolls being melted down, revealing how Goldfinger was smuggling his gold out of the country. He also overhears Goldfinger mentioning Operation Grandslam before encountering Tilly, who is attempting once again to kill Goldfinger. But she triggers an alarm, and at last we get the car chase where we get to see the gadgets in action. But as fun as they are, they're not enough. Bond is captured and Oddjob kills Tilly as she tries to run away. Bond is brought back into the factory, but we know that there is one final gadget that hasn't been used.
Ejector seat, you're joking.
I never joke about my work, 007.
After a chase around Pinewood Studios, Bond crashes and is again taken captive, and he wakes up in one of the most famous scenes in cinematic history.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Bond has absolutely nothing to rely on. No gadgets, no allies, nothing. Connery makes us feel Bond's worry and his panic in this moment, and like his moments of sadness, it works so well because we're used to seeing him being so cool and unflappable. When Bond is genuinely scared like this, we cannot help but feel the same way, and no one does that contrast better than Connery.
I think you've made your point, Goldfinger. Thank you for the demonstration.
But in the end, of course, Bond is ultimately successful. As in the book, Goldfinger realizes that Bond will be more useful to him alive than dead, and so decides to bring him along as his prisoner. So after being knocked out again, Bond wakes up in a private jet to the sight of Honor Blackman and the most ridiculous Bond girl name of all time.
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming.
Besides Connery himself, Honor Blackman was the most famous member of the cast, having been a lead in the popular British TV show The Avengers, which has nothing to do with Marvel. And right from the moment she introduces herself, she absolutely owns this role. She's almost daring the audience to make fun of her and the name which, even though it comes from the novel, was a difficult thing to get past the American censor.
Every now and then Trevelyan, who was our big enemy, said, "You can't say that." I said, "Come on, John. I mean, if an 11-year-old understands he's a dirty little bugger, and what are you going to do about it? Believe me, 90% of the 11-year-olds, it will go sailing over their heads. If the dirty little bugger understands, then he's in advance of his years and you can't protect him."
In the book, Pussy is one of the gangsters Goldfinger recruits to help with Operation Grandslam, but from very early on in the script, she was changed to be Goldfinger's pilot instead. Like Tilly, Pussy is an openly queer character in Ian Fleming's novel, but unlike Tilly, the film definitely suggests this more explicitly for Pussy.
You can turn off the charm. I'm immune.
Anyway, we'll come back to her because Bond needs to order his famous drink for the first time.
A martini, shaken, not stirred.
And so we arrive in Kentucky, and it's here, for me, that the film starts to go downhill a bit. I know I have been gushing about this movie for the last half hour or so, but that's because, in my view, the first half of Goldfinger is about as good as Bond ever gets. Almost every single scene has an iconic moment, and it just flows so beautifully from scene to scene as we get carried along on this glamorous international adventure. That all stops dead in Kentucky, which besides not being a particularly cinematic location, especially compared to, say, Switzerland, it's also where the story slows right down. Bond arrives here about an hour into the movie, and in that time we have had the opening, the song, Miami and the Golden Jill, scenes with M, Moneypenny and Q, the golf game, the Furka pass and meeting with Tilly, the car chase, the laser interrogation, and the meeting with the Bond girl. The second half of the movie, another 50 minutes, is all spent in this one place, and the time is not used anywhere nearly as effectively. I think when most people talk about how great Goldfinger is, they're thinking of the first half more than the second. So let's get into it. Bond is locked up, but naturally he escapes with nothing but his wits. Now, this is a funny scene, but it is intentionally funny, unlike the scene where Goldfinger is briefing all of the mob bosses on Operation Grandslam, which is accidentally funny. Now, I know these characters are supposed to be stereotypical 60s gangsters, but I just love it how anytime anything happens in this scene, they all react like they're in a Family Guy skit.
What's going on? Hey, what is it? Hey, on the floor, my feet! What is this? A merry-go-round?
But Ken Adams' set is enough to distract us from all of that. Adam had of course made his mark on Dr. No, but his work was notably missing in From Russia with Love, because Stanley Kubrick wanted him to do Dr. Strangelove instead. But now he is back in fine form, giving us a set for Goldfinger's Ranch that is totally different from anything in Dr. No, while also being immediately recognizable as his work. Also, fun fact, but that little model of Fort Knox in the center is now permanently on display in the real Fort Knox. Anyway, Bond overhears Goldfinger's plan to gas the area around the bank and break into the vault with his laser. But he's caught by Pussy while Goldfinger, having explained his plan, proceeds to kill all of the gangsters. Except one solo survivor who takes his money and leaves. And then we have probably the single most pointless scene in all of Bond, where we spend the next 5 minutes watching Oddjob kill the gangster and dispose of his body by having the car crushed and plonked on the back of another car pretty much in real time. This whole sequence drags on and on and on, and at the end of it, absolutely nothing has changed. All of the gangsters are still dead, Felix still doesn't know anything about Goldfinger's plan, and Bond is still captured. It's an example of how the flow of the movie just completely changes in the second half. The scene was totally unnecessary, but even if the filmmakers felt like it was needed, there's no justification for it being this drawn out. But I think this is kind of the fault of the movie's strict production timeline. It came right down to the wire, with Eon insisting on their target release date and not budging. Hell, these were the final shots filmed and they were taken just 3 weeks before release. Future 𝗺𝗵𝗻𝗃 director Peter Hunt was working furiously on the edit with Guy Hamilton, who said that even if they had had another week or so, it might have been a tighter film. In the book Some Kind of Hero, Hamilton reflects on how he and Hunt showed what they thought of as a rough cut to 𝗵𝗵𝗻𝗃. Every 5 minutes we would look at each other and nod because we'd see a trim. It's awful when you know what would improve it, and there were sections where more than a trim was needed. The lights came on and Cubby and Harry say, "Yeah, we like it, we got a picture," and we burst into tears. If only I had had another week. So having this context does help explain why the second half isn't as tight as it could be, but the fact is that it does impact the overall quality of the finished product. Anyway, we have another excellent scene between Connery and Goldfinger, where Bond figures out Goldfinger's plan and in doing so also fixes the biggest plot hole in the Fleming novel. The original story has Goldfinger planning to break into Fort Knox with a bomb and actually steal all the gold. The screenwriters wanted to change that, and Connery is given lines that explicitly state why.
$15 billion in gold bullion weighs 10,500 tons. 60 men would take 12 days to load it onto 200 trucks.
I think this is a great bit of adaptation. It's acknowledging the source material, but also explaining why they have changed it. And the new plan is so much more fiendish. Bond works out that Goldfinger doesn't want to steal the gold, but instead wants to detonate a nuclear bomb inside the Fort Knox vault, making the US gold worthless while his own stocks will skyrocket in value. It's such a devious Bond villain plan, and I love how the scene shows Bond slowly working it out, and Goldfinger basking in his own brilliance. The reason the dynamic between Bond and Goldfinger is so good in this movie is because screenwriter Richard Maibaum knew that this was the core of the movie. He described it like this: whereas Dr. No was a mystery and From Russia with Love was a straight suspense story, Goldfinger is what I would call a duel, Bond versus Goldfinger. It is not, I repeat, not a story about a robbery. It's such a good way of approaching this story and resisting the temptation for the heist to overshadow the deeper theme. Fleming's story focuses much more on the heist itself. Like, this portion of the book sees Bond and Tilly working as secretaries for Goldfinger as he puts the finishing touches on the plan, with Bond trying to figure out a way to warn Felix about it before it's too late. There are lots of really exciting scenes where James Bond does things like copy out meeting agendas. Anyway, after being dismissed, Bond and Pussy are reunited once again. Goldfinger have instructed her to keep him busy to throw off any suspicions Felix and the CIA might have that Bond is in danger. The chemistry between Connery and Honor Blackman is evident throughout all of their encounters, despite the fact that they mostly consist of Pussy being fed up with Bond and bossing him about.
Who taught you judo?
The gun you took.
But this brings us into some pretty uncomfortable territory because we've arrived at one of the most contentious and hotly debated scenes in all of Bond, so if you'd rather not listen to a discussion about sexual assault, then skip ahead to this time, because it's pretty hard to read this scene in any other way. And look, I'll be the first to acknowledge that a lot of things in the James Bond movies haven't aged that well, but they are reflective of attitudes at the time the movies were made. And for that reason, I tend not to dwell on them too much in these videos because, for better or worse, they are part of the history of the series and of society as a whole. But this scene is a rare example of something that was not acceptable even at the time the movie was made. This scene can't just be thrown into the basket of casual sexism of the 1960s, like, say, this.
Man talk.
Because this is the only time where Bond uses his physical strength to literally force himself onto a woman who is actively resisting him. There are other instances in Bond where the consent is murky or where there was an element of coercion involved with the power dynamic, but it always had a relatively playful undercurrent that made the consent fairly clear, even if this isn't necessarily how modern audiences would interpret some of those scenes. Now, the tossing about in the hay is kind of presented in a playful fashion, but it is clear that Pussy does not see it this way, especially when you consider the fact that she is a queer character, and it's especially clear that Pussy is not just playing around when she actively tries to push him off her and not let him kiss her. By any definition, this scene shows our hero using his physical strength to force someone into sleeping with him. And there is a word for that, and even by the standards of the 1960s, it is absolutely not the sort of thing a character like James Bond should be doing. And because of that, this scene ends up being the focus for much of the discussion about the character of Pussy Galore, which is a shame because she is one of the all-time great Bond girls and is so much more than just this moment. Now, it's a complete cliche at this point for every single Bond girl on the press junket to say that her character is not like the other Bond girls.
Very different from the other Bond girls.
It's sort of a relationship that's sort of more up to date and more developed.
It's a little bit different with my characters. I don't think they ever thought about me, oh, Bond girl.
She's a very complex being.
Right, she's totally unlike a lot of the other Bond leading ladies in that way.
She's not like what you can expect from a Bond girl. She's more of a real character.
But that trend actually started all the way back in 1964 because at that time, Pussy really wasn't like the other Bond girls. Iconic as they are, Honey Rider and Tatiana were relatively passive characters whose involvement in the story centered entirely around Bond. Pussy, meanwhile, is effectively number 2 to Goldfinger. She's a core part of his operation and a leader of her own team who has a complete arc and purpose completely independently of Bond. And instead of becoming immediately smitten by him or finding herself dragged along on his adventure against her will, Pussy consistently confronts, challenges, and rejects Bond. She's even a match for him physically at first. The power dynamic is totally different from her two predecessors, and it is really what makes her stand out as such a memorable character. Oh, and it's a small point, but she's also one of the very few Bond girls to be older than the Bond actor she is appearing alongside, which was pretty progressive for 1964. And let's not forget that in the movie, she is the one who saves the day, not Bond.
And Pussy?
She helped to switch the gas in the canisters. By the way, what made her call Washington?
And this is kind of true in the book as well, but it's probably the one change the filmmakers wrote that made this story worse. In the book, Goldfinger convinced Pussy that they were only stunning the people guarding Fort Knox. When she discovers the truth that he planned to kill them all, she switches sides. In the movie, however, the reason she decides not to gas thousands of people to death isn't because she had a moral awakening, but instead got swayed by the sheer power of Sean Connery's heterosexuality.
I must have appealed to a maternal instinct.
And to be fair to the Bond series, the very next movie would explicitly call out this particular plot point.
James Bond, who only has to make love to a woman, she repents and immediately returns to the side of right and virtue.
Anyway, let's move on to the finale of the movie where Operation Grandslam falls into place. We see the flying circus release the gas and take out the soldiers defending Fort Knox. And this is another example of a scene that could have done with a bit more of an edit. The gassing takes a fairly long time, during which time we see dozens of extras do a really convincing job of falling unconscious. Now, we could have conveyed this in maybe 2 or 3 shots, but no, let's make it 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shots. Again, I think if Peter Hunt had had more time in the edit suite, he'd have tightened this up, because the earlier scenes like the car chase and the Switzerland sequence haven't got a wasted frame in them. Something similar happens when Goldfinger breaks into Fort Knox. It should be a cool, explosive, and exciting scene, but instead the whole thing plays out pretty much in real time, with everyone putting on gas masks, then driving off, and down the road, and down another road, and around the corner, then up the driveway, until finally they get to the gates. But then we slowly unload the explosives, lay them down at the gates, delicately put the firing cable in, reel it out, connect it to the plunger, then we blow them up. Finally, we're in. But no, let's drive calmly up to the doors, slowly reveal the laser, then back up the truck, then slowly cut open the vault door with it, then rig up some chains, then attach them to the door, and after 5 minutes of screen time, we're inside. Oh, and the whole time there's basically no dialogue, but instead we have this. It's not John Barry's strongest work, but thankfully once we get inside Fort Knox, the movie returns to form. This cathedral of gold is the set Ken Adam has said he is the most proud of, and you can see why. This towering vault forms the backdrop of the movie's finale, where Bond and Oddjob are locked inside while outside a huge gun battle begins, because the American soldiers had only faked their death to lure Goldfinger in. This would become another hallmark of the Bond series, with the ending being a confrontation between Bond and the villain or henchman, set against the backdrop of a big cinematic shootout. Bond's fight with Oddjob is such a fantastic piece of filmmaking, and once again shows shows the way in which Guy Hamilton always tried to put Bond at a disadvantage. This is not someone he can beat in a straight fight. He is totally vulnerable, and there's the added tension from the literal ticking clock that Peter Hunt makes sure we constantly cut back to. But when Bond picks up Oddjob's hat, it is the one moment where we see the henchman show fear. But Bond misses and the hat is lodged in the railings, and in a moment of pure ingenuity, he electrocutes the bars just as Oddjob grabs it.
Shocking. Positively shocking.
Meanwhile, Goldfinger and his army have been fighting off the Americans outside. Goldfinger escapes disguised convincingly as an American officer who speaks with a thick German accent.
Each one of them so's the girl. I'll get her. You get it all open.
Felix and the gang get into the vault, all the while as the bomb ticks down to 0. In the final seconds, Bond is about to risk it all when they reach him and defuse it, leaving the counter, of course, on 007 because 𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗃 made the now obvious call that a 3-digit timer in a Bond movie that starts with 2 zeros should end in 7, not 3 as originally planned. But it does make Bond's quip a bit of a continuity error.
3 more ticks and Mr. Goldfinger would have hit the jackpot.
Bond gets onto a private jet to be congratulated by the president, and we get one of my favourite Bond-Felix interactions.
I told the stewardess, liquor for 3.
Who are the other 2?
Oh, there are no other 2.
And it wouldn't be a Bond movie without a bit of contrivance, because unbeknownst to all of these people, Goldfinger has taken out the real crew of the plane and is waiting for Bond on board. Bond, of course, takes it in his stride.
Well, congratulations on your promotion, Goldfinger.
The close quarters fight between the two ends with the window being shot out and Goldfinger being sucked into outer space, just as Bond had foreshadowed earlier in the movie.
If you fight at this close range, the bullet will pass through me and the fuselage. The cabin will depressurize and we'll both be sucked into outer space together.
You might call it Chekhov's golden gun. Bond and Pussy manage to escape from the crashing plane, and Bond being Bond, he would rather get on with her than be rescued. Besides 𝗬𝗵𝗫, every Bond movie until Casino Royale would end like this, and I just love how neat it is. The plot is foiled, the villain is dead, and Bond gets the girl. There's no need for an epilogue or a debrief, the story and movie is done, and so we just pan away, roll credits, and as ever, we are left with the promise that James Bond will be back.
Brilliant.
Goldfinger is not a perfect movie, and it's not even my favourite Connery Bond. That title goes to From Russia with Love, but it is undeniably the single most influential movie in the entire Bond series. Its Midas touch coloured every single Bond movie that followed, and its DNA is woven into the very fabric of the series in a way that no other Bond movie ever matched. 60 years later, and parts of Goldfinger are still among the best James Bond ever was, but the key to the longevity of the series is the way in which it managed to grow, adapt, and improve upon the formula that this movie laid down. A formula that, along with the perfect combination of cast, crew, director, and writers, made Goldfinger one of the most important movies not just in the Bond series, but of all time.
Well now, what do we have here?
If you've been following me on Letterboxd, then you'll know that a cinema in London is re-showing all of the Bond movies in chronological order throughout the year. I am planning to see every single one of them because for most of them it'll be my first time getting to experience them on the big screen. And after I've seen them all as they were meant to be seen, at the end of the year I'll be publishing a video ranking all 25 Eon Bond movies over on my Patreon. So feel free to sign up there where there are some other bonus videos and more, or just follow me on Letterboxd if you want some sneak previews of my thoughts on each Bond movie as I rewatch them. Thank you for watching, and thanks to my patrons for keeping the videos sponsor-free for everyone. As always, Pentex's James Bond video essays will return.